Welcome to Philosophy and Faith, where our goal is to help you navigate your intellectual and spiritual journey, especially in regards to topics like God, faith and doubt, meaning and purpose, and more. I'm Nathan Beasley.
And I'm Daniel Jepson. And together we discuss the big questions that humans have wrestled with for thousands of years.
We're glad you can join us.
And we're back. We're going to dive back into the history of philosophy.
Cool. So who is up for today?
You know, I titled this one, I might change it before it actually gets published, but for right now, it's titled The Malaysian School and the Supposed Rationality of Greek Philosophy.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm just doing that to draw in all the clicks and all the views there.
Yeah, I know a lot of us are searching for Malaysius.
Yeah, I get people all the time come up to me and ask me to explain the Malaysian school of philosophy and
Yes.
the rationality or irrationality of early Greek thought.
Yeah, definitely something that's getting a lot of searches.
Yeah, we're writing that.
Yeah, exactly. So Milesius, I'm assuming it's named after a guy.
No,
Oh, okay.
it's named after a city.
Okay.
Miletus.
Miletus.
Yeah.
There it is.
So people from there are called Milesians.
Okay.
And it's on what would today be the western edge of Turkey, but it was a Greek colony. So it was a Greek-speaking, Greek-thinking colony. And it was there that last week we talked about a man named Thales lived and taught, and he's regarded usually as the first philosopher, at least in the Western world.
Yes. It's all coming back now.
All right. Yeah, we talked about Thales and his idea that everything is water and some of the other things that he talked about.
Yeah. Can you give us a brief overview, just a little recap of where we've been with that?
So far we've talked about pre-philosophical thought patterns that were already in play. So people like Thales and the people we'll talk about today, they did not make up these ideas out of whole cloth. They were part of an intellectual culture and community, just like we all are. And so that's going to influence them. So the first episode we talked about the irrational elements within Greek thought, even predating the Olympian religion, but carrying on all the way through that as well. And especially the very, very earliest things that we know about Greek thinking was that they viewed reality as something like existing in this shapeless stream, a Mother Earth type of thing that just, it produced these things that come to exist, people, plants, animals, but they all go back into this endless cycle, as it were. And we talked in the first episode about why that would be viewed as irrational rather than a rational type of philosophy and its continuing impact. Now, Thales comes at that with some of that same background because he's focused on asking the question, all right, when I look at this reality, what is the one thing? So he's presupposing that there is one chief thing of which everything else is of a part, and it goes back into that.
And that one thing was water.
For him, it was, yeah.
If I remember. And I remember you saying it wasn't as important that was his answer, but the fact that he gave an answer was significant because he was the first person to write down or record an answer, at least that we have record of.
Well, right. And more particularly because the answer he gave was not based upon received tradition of a religious kind or a cultural kind.
Yeah, that's right.
But it was the product of his own rational mind and perhaps to some degree to observation. I mean, water's all around us. We need water to live. But at the same time, his statement, all this water, goes far beyond what you could observe. So it's a metaphysical claim.
Okay, yeah. So we're continuing in that philosophical stream, pun intended.
Yes, we are.
And today we're going to be talking about the next two thinkers chronologically, right?
Right.
So why don't you introduce us to the next two guys?
Okay. And this is where it gets a little tricky because they have very similar sounding names, and neither name really trips off the tongue very easily for us, at least. So the first one is Anaximander, and the second one is Anaximenes.
Anaximander and Anaximenes.
Yep.
Okay, can you spell that for people who actually want to Google these guys?
Sure. Anaximander is spelled Anaximander. So Anax and then I and Mander, as it were.
Okay.
The emphasis is on the second symbol, Anaximander. And then Anaximenes is Anax, so it starts the same way. I am Still have it going. And then ENES, Anaximenes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's easy to get them confused. I mean, I've read about them for a long time, and it's easy to still get them confused in my mind. And probably it's not that big a deal that we keep them distinct because we're going to talk about them kind of holistically. After a minute, anyway, we'll talk about their differences. Now, the legend is that Anaximander was a student of Thales, and that Anaximenes was a student of
Anaximander.
Anaximander. Yes,
Yeah,
Anaximander.
this is going to be tough.
Yes, it is. Now, that hasn't been proven. It's a tradition. But chronologically, there does seem to be a flow. Thales was a little bit older than these other twos. And so most people would group them together and call them the Milesian school because they're all living in Miletus around the same time period. And they have a good deal in common.
Like what?
Like Thales, they were all looking for the one thing that everything else was composed of. The arche is a Greek word there, the primary element. For Thales, the arche, the one thing, was water. Anaximander said, no, that's not going to do. He also believed in one essence of all things, but felt it can't be something physical and finite like water. So he said the arche was, in Greek, the aporon. The aporon.
What's that mean?
It means the boundless, the infinite, the formless. It's infinite both in time and space, but it can't be identified with one element like water.
So like the cosmos, kind of?
Yeah, it's a little bit unclear, but I think he means it more abstractly than that as well.
Okay.
So the cosmos is many things. This is one thing underneath all that.
Okay.
So the physical elements and even worlds come in and out of existence based upon that, while it itself is unchanged. And I was trying to think of a good analogy. I'm not sure this is a good one, but it might be. So have you ever seen a stream maybe, and it's got a small waterfall to it? And you sit and watch the waterfall for a little bit, and you notice bubbles arise on the surface now and then.
Yeah.
And the bubble will rise, and then it'll stay there for a few seconds, flow down the stream a little bit, and then disappear back into the stream.
Yeah.
From what I gather, he viewed the worlds and the physical elements of the world something like that. You have this unbounded, indefinite stream, as it were, and then all the physical elements and even worlds come out of that for a while, and then he's all back into it.
Huh. Yeah, it seems like a neat illustration.
Oh, thanks.
Helpful. Yeah.
And then he also had ideas about the world. Now, Thales said the world was like a disk that's floating on water, because again, everything is water.
Yeah.
But he said, no, that won't work because then what would be holding the water up, right? So he viewed the earth as something like a drum, and we are living on the top of that drum. So again, the earth would be flat, but it's not resting on anything. It's equal distance from all other possible things. Therefore, it doesn't move because there's no reason for it to move one place as opposed to another. So he's trying to give a rational explanation, not only for the reality, but also why the world doesn't move as he thought it didn't anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right. So in that regard, he's following up on Thales, but he's also kind of pushing back on what we would regard as the most objectionable part of Thales, that you could identify things with one particular element. But at the same time, he's in that same stream of thought, as it were. In fact, he's hearkening back to a time, that shapeless stream that we talked about in the very first episode. And again, it's not a rational thing. This is not directed towards a purpose and order towards that. So the idea of purposefulness is not involved here.
In the world.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or in reality as a whole.
Oh, yeah.
For the most part, Greeks would view reality as, if guided by anything, simply impersonal fate.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'll come back to that idea.
Okay, so that's Anaximander.
Yeah.
So what about his, would you call it what, apprentice or disciple?
That's what he was supposed to be called. Anaximenes.
Yeah, Anaximenes. So what about Anaximenes?
He agreed and disagreed with Anaximander. He agreed that the arche, that first principle, must be infinite, but disagreed that it could not be definitive, that it could not be identified with something that we can experience here, as it were. So he argued that the arche, that overriding principle, is air.
Hmm.
So you've got Thales with water, you've got Anaximenes with air. And remember, in the Greek thought, there were four basic elements, right? Earth, air, water, fire.
Okay.
So you've got two of these guys already claiming two of those. That's the most important. And then Heraclitus, which we won't get to today, would say it's fire.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, as far as I know, none of the Greek thinkers would say everything is earth because that seems less changeable than the other things.
That feels like matter to me. Like that feels like our perception is like everything is matter. That's like earth, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's a good thought. I hadn't thought of that.
Well, when you mentioned the stream and the bubbles, when you said you're going to give an illustration, the illustration that popped in my mind was like matter, where it like it is one thing, but it comes and goes in different forms. But I don't know. That's just my mind. I don't know if that's a good
Yeah.
illustration or not.
No, I think it is. Yeah.
But anyway, so you got earth, air, fire, and water, and Anaximenes is saying it's wind.
Yes, wind or air or breath.
Okay.
Again, the Greek words can often mean many things in our language because we have a much fuller vocabulary, as it were.
Okay, so that's helpful because I was thinking wind, everything's wind. So is he talking like breath, you think?
Yeah, it's actually kind of vapor or breath may be a better idea than just the wind that we see outside of us. But from what I can tell, he kind of goes back and forth between what we might say is breath
Okay.
or wind. But again, it's pneuma, basically. So,
Okay. Spirit.
yeah, pneuma, the Greek word, would be that
Okay.
wind or breath, and
Okay.
then also spirit.
Hmm.
So he viewed also the earth as a flat disk. But unlike Thales, who said it was floating on water, he said it's floating on air, like a frisbee.
Huh.
No, he didn't actually use the word frisbee. But that's a pretty good idea. And we could see why he might say everything is air or that air is the most fundamental principle. I mean, we live only as long as we breathe, right?
Yeah.
So might suggest to someone that air is a principle of life or breath. And many Greek philosophers, not only here but elsewhere, felt humans were a literal microcosm, a small model of the cosmos as a whole, which is an interesting thought. Yeah, I'm not sure where necessarily that came from, but you're going to see it again.
Can you unpack that a little bit? What does that mean?
That in some way, the human body and the human person is a microcosm, literally, small cosmos, and that what we are is analogous to what the cosmos is as a whole.
So thinking about this as an analogy, then we are like mostly made up of wind.
Yeah, I guess he would probably, I'm not sure if he would make that point or not.
Huh.
But
It's just an interesting thought.
right. And also air is all around us, right? And so it seems to be infinite or at least boundless.
Yeah.
So it makes it a good candidate to say this is the one thing. But it does present a challenge. How does air turn into things like water and fire and earth and stone and so on? Now, Thales tried to give an answer of how water did that a little bit, but it was very sketchy and insufficient. Anaximenes does give a more detailed explanation, and it's related to the fact that wind or breath can change. So it can feel heavy or thin, moist or dry. It can be condensed, or it can be thinned out, rarefied air. Now, I don't know how much he knew of this, but if you go to the top of a mountain, the air is less dense, right?
Yeah.
You have rarefied air. So he said that rarefied air or thin air becomes lighter and warmer until it eventually becomes fire. And then when it's condensed, when it becomes compressed, as it were, then it becomes heavier and colder and becomes cloud, then water, ice, stone, and earth. So interesting theory there.
Yeah, I can see how we could get there.
Yeah.
If you think about it, that it does seem like air turns into water in the clouds somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And then also fire being made up of air.
Sure.
Like I can see how that fundamentally works, I guess.
Right. Yeah. A little less obvious how it becomes, say, stone or mud or something.
Right. But it also works with water too, that water becomes solid or becomes gas.
Right. Yeah, I think we talked about that last episode when we talked about Thales.
Yeah. Gonna be interesting how fire and earth work. But yeah.
Well, again, what's important here is not whether he was right or not. Spoiler alert, he was not. It wasn't the answers he gave, but rather how he answered it. It wasn't an appeal to myth or tradition or religious dogma. It was through human reasoning, observing the world around you and making inferences based upon that alone. So those are the most salient points for those two. So you've got Thales, everything is water. The archon is water. You've got Anaximander. The one is this shapeless, unbound thing. And then you've got Anaximenes. The one is the air, and everything changes into and out of that. And that's where these guys were going. So for the most part, they were dealing with metaphysics. They're not going to deal with ethics or epistemology.
Yeah.
So the first philosophers are metaphysicians.
Well, the epistemological claim seems to be that they're going to be trying to use their own minds apart from what you said.
That's actually where we're going to.
Okay.
So they weren't necessarily self-reflective about that, but that certainly doesn't mean that their ideas don't have epistemological implications.
Right, yeah.
So maybe let's give some initial analysis here. We're only 3 philosophers into this. Maybe it's too soon to give an analysis, but at the same time, it lays the groundwork for understanding how to evaluate the other philosophers who are going to come along down the pike, as it were.
Yeah, makes sense.
So, as we talked about, these philosophers are not important because of their answers, but because of their questions and the way they answered those questions. They were concerned with metaphysics, not just physics. And what I mean by that, they weren't just concerned with understanding how the world works enough so that you get a better crop or you can navigate the seas better or something like that. They wanted to know for knowledge's sake alone. And they wanted to know not just things of this world, but also more transcendent questions. What is the ultimate nature of reality? So that's the difference between a physical question, science, chemistry, physics, something like that. Why does this do this? Why does this dissolve here but not here? Those are physical questions, but they're asking metaphysical, things that are above and beyond that, as it were. And that's why they're usually regarded as the first philosophers. And then second, the answers they gave, again, we've talked about this, are answers based upon human reasoning interacting with human observation. And that is a break, for the most part, from what we've seen most of the wisdom teachers of the past, what they were doing. So those are 2 things. Now, I do want to mention, though, here, and this is where we're going to get some analysis that might seem premature, but I don't think so. I think it's going to be helpful. There are at least 3 things that these philosophers of the Milesian schools believed that they could not prove. And these same things are going to be assumed. They're going to be presuppositions for almost all the Greek philosophers, and indeed most non-religious philosophers even today.
Oh, okay.
So this is going to be very important that they're building on this foundation. So it's almost like they have this project here of understanding the world through human reasoning, and they're the ones starting this project. They're building this foundation. Others are going to build upon it. But let's examine this foundation first.
Okay. Yeah, what are the 3?
Well, first, they assumed the eternity of matter, or the arche, that first principle. Anaximander is the possible exception to this, since it's not clear to what degree he would say that the aporon, as he called it, is material. But at the same time, he is not coming to the idea that it had a beginning, that it was a created thing. He seemed to view it as eternal. There's no creator-created distinction within any of this. Matter of whatever kind that you view is eternal. And the reason that's important is because the fundamental difference here between that and Hebrew or Christian or Islamic thought is this, that those latter 3 are going to be based upon this idea that there is a fundamental distinction between creator and creation, and that you can't understand creation without understanding also the creator, or at least understanding that it is created. So these men and Greek philosophy as a whole then are going to assume that there is no creation, but that matter, however they're going to define it, is eternal. It didn't begin to exist.
Yeah, I know we've talked a lot about that in past episodes, like That is a huge fundamental difference. It really makes all the difference.
It does. And I hope we can sketch that out a bit.
Yeah, for sure. But it makes sense that the question of metaphysics comes first before the question of ethics.
Yes.
Because if you have a creator who's creating things in his image, and ethics come from the character of that created being, that's a completely different foundation than, if your foundation is ethical. I don't know, what's the word there? Not ethical object like water or wind.
Okay. Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Sure. Yeah, non-purposeful ultimate
Yeah.
reality.
No purpose or no, yeah.
Right. And really, I don't think I'm overstating when I'm saying that pretty much all Greek philosophy is going to view it this way. For example, Plato, well, he has an idea of creation or a story of creation, but it's fundamentally different than the Christian or the Jewish or Islamic story, because what happens there is that some spiritual being he calls a Demiurge takes pre-existing matter that's already eternal and then begins to form that. So he doesn't create that, he just fashions it that's already there. So even he, who has what many people call a creation story, it's not really a creation story, it's a fashioning or forming story at best. So anyway, that's the first thing.
So first one is that they all assume that the eternity of matter, however they define that.
Yes.
Okay, so what's the second one?
All right. The second is that they believe reality is able to be rationally understood.
So this is kind of the epistemological foundation, undergirding.
Right. So they're going to assume this. They're not going to argue it. I said that they didn't argue epistemology, and they don't. But that doesn't mean they're not making epistemological assumptions.
So are they intentionally trying to not incorporate religious dogmas or cultural myths that they have from the time?
Well, it seems to. I mean, we don't have a clear statement of their intentions for the most part. So reading between the lines of what they're doing, they're striking out in a very different direction.
Okay.
Now, it's not clear that they had any idea of the Hebrew scriptures or the ideas of a creation distinction. So it's not like we can accuse them of understanding that and rejecting that.
Right.
But anyway, going back to this idea, they believe reality is able to be rationally understood. If it's not, then there's no point in anything that they're doing, right? So the whole premise is based upon this idea that reality is understandable, that it's rationally understandable. It conforms to the laws that we would say are rational and able to be understood and communicated. And I was trying to think of a good way to illustrate this. So, you know Spanish pretty well, but they use the same letters as English, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was...
Generally speaking.
Okay. I remember when I was learning Greek or Hebrew, the letters are very different, especially in Hebrew. All of them are different. And even to write them takes practice. And so I remember many times I'd fill up a page or two just practicing writing different letters. Okay, I'm going to write this one for a while. Okay, I'm tired of writing that one. I'm going to write this one. Now, imagine someone from another time or place or culture or whatever. They discover one of these pages that I was writing, and they look at this and they're going to make the assumption that there is some message here that whoever wrote this is communicating to them. But in fact, they're going to be in error, right? Because I'm writing things, but I'm not writing sentences, ideas, rational thoughts, things that could be understood. All I'm writing are markings, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
Or say that you grew up in a society that had no history with written music at all. So no music notation, no music theory. And there's a shipwreck, and on the shore, a score for an instrumental music piece comes up, Bach's Fifth Symphony or something like that. All right, now all of a sudden you've got on this piece of paper all these markings. You have to determine if those markings have a meaning or not. Or could someone just simply be practicing markings for some reason, like I would be practicing writing down those Hebrew letters? What all these thinkers are assuming, their presupposition that is unproven, is that reality can be understood intellectually, rationally. But you can't prove that. You can only assume it.
So is the illustration of the musical score, the people find that and then they just presume that somebody's trying to communicate something? Like
Yes.
That's the presumption?
Or that it could be understood in a rational way.
Okay. So the analogy is that the Greek thinkers look around, these guys look around and presume that it can be understood in a rational way.
Yes.
Okay.
Think of another analogy, because none of these are perfect. You've got a 1-year-old at home, right?
Yeah.
Imagine that you leave your laptop open. Peter comes up to it one day. You've got your Google Docs open, right? And maybe it's some document that you're sharing with me or somebody else. And Peter comes up to it and starts tapping on the keyboard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he's just barely 1. He doesn't understand words, languages, letters, or anything like that. All he knows is this is what Daddy does. He comes over here and he presses all these buttons. So he does that. And then I get that because you've already included me in the document as someone who has viewing or editing rights. And I'm like, wait a second. What's Nathan trying to tell me with this? What's he communicating? So I'm making the assumption that what I'm seeing is able to be rationally understood without knowing that that's the case. That's a presupposition on my behalf.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And that's fair. I mean, we believe that too.
Sure. We believe it as believers because we believe in the creator-creation distinction, that this universe is here as a purposeful and rational creation, a rational act from a rational being, a mind, a spirit, person. Okay, but if you disregard that, then are we sure that rationality, logic, even the laws of physics apply at all times past and present, all places within this universe or outside this universe, if there would be an outside this universe? In other words, for the most part, we're making the assumption reality can be understood, but we can't necessarily prove that on the basis of simply saying, well, reality is just water or reality is just air.
Yeah, this is, I can definitely see how some of our discussions about naturalism or materialism built on this foundation. I remember you reading Steven Pinker's book, quoting it, him saying the mind isn't designed to find purpose or make any sort of metaphysical claims. And yet in that book, he was making metaphysical claims.
All the time.
So he's assuming about himself that he's able to do that. But if his own mind is a product of, water or matter or wind or whatever it is, you kind of have to back that claim up.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to see if it's consistent with the other things you're teaching.
Right. So that's really interesting to me that they would presume that reality is able to be rationally understood.
Yeah.
It seems like most people do.
Yes, we do. But that's what philosophy is for, is ask that question instead of presume it.
Yeah. So, yeah.
And ask on what basis you would make that claim. All right. The last part kind of goes along with this, but it's different. And in fact, I think this is probably more important. They're making the assumption, as many non-religious philosophers do today, that not only is reality able to be rationally understood, but the human mind is able to understand it without aid, that it is a sufficient instrument in itself to be able to actually understand what the truth about reality is. And that's a different claim. So one is about the nature of reality, the other is about the nature of the human mind. Can the human mind actually understand anything metaphysical? They all believed the human mind is able to understand reality without aid. They believed autonomous human reasoning is a tool sufficient to the job of understanding the truth about that reality.
So you mean without aid as in like without divine revelation?
Yes.
Okay.
That's exactly what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you and I would believe that we can have confidence that the human mind can know truth because we presume, we've got the presupposition. Whether we can prove it or not is another question, but it's consistent with this, that we are created in the image and likeness of God, who is a rational being and who created this world rationally because it's a product of himself. There is an internal consistency with our worldview.
Right.
But if you reject that, if my mind is simply water or air or molecules in motion or atoms, or simply something else that maybe I don't define necessarily, but it's only the product of natural selection alone, created to increase my genes' chances of surviving to the next generation and reproducing to the next generation, then can I really have confidence that it can understand truth about things like this? So they're making that presupposition.
Yeah.
One of the ways to think about this is I have a pair of binoculars, and they're a great instrument for some things. Like if I'm out on a sunny day and there's a bird across the field, they're pretty good for that.
Yeah.
You know what they're not good for?
What?
They're not good for seeing in the dark because they're simply not the right tool. So there are things that I could see in the dark if I had night vision goggles,
Hmm.
but I can't with a pair of binoculars. They're not a good tool for seeing far-flung nebulae or something like that,
Right.
simply because they're not powerful enough. It's not that they're a bad tool, but the tool is not sufficient for those types of jobs. The human mind may be a good tool to understand how to get a better crop yield for next year or understand how to make a map of the coastline, but it's a presumption to believe they could also understand the very fundamental natures of reality, of which it itself is a part of.
Hmm.
That is a presumption. That is a presupposition that you cannot prove.
Yeah, it's interesting that most philosophies have certain presumptions.
I think they all do.
Like you can't really get away from that, and you can't start ex nihilo.
No, my opinion is that every worldview has its presuppositions that cannot necessarily be proven. What you can do to adjudicate between them, though, is to look at what the worldview is and then ask, okay, based upon its presuppositions, is the rest of it coherent with that?
Yeah.
Does it fit in together? Is it coherent with the reality we see? Is it self consistent? And is it livable? So there are tests for worldviews, but I believe each one has certain presuppositions that go beyond proof, as it were.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to look at the history of this because you see that even this early on, and it's really neat to see the way that these guys had some fundamental ideas that people are still building on today.
Yeah,
Couple
I think
millennia
those
old.
three ideas, that matter is eternal, that reality can be understood or is understandable, and third, that the human mind is the tool to be able to understand it, are still very much with us. And I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying that once you reject God, you cannot prove any of those, and they actually seem a little bit inconsistent in some ways with most of the worldviews that arise out of them.
Hmm. Or reject at least the kind of God described by Hebrew thought.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Theism, basically Hebrew, Christian, or Islamic thought. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question. One thing I'm noticing is that all these guys are trying to boil reality down to one thing.
Uh-huh.
Why just one thing? Why not two things or five things?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I'm smart enough to have a take on that. So take it with a grain of salt, but since you asked my opinion, I'll give it a shot.
Sure.
Part of it is there is within us a desire for intellectual simplicity, and boiling everything down to one thing is maybe the ultimate expression of that. Also, along with that, there is this idea that there has to be something to tie everything else together, because if there weren't, then there would not be this coherent cosmos, as it were. We might have all kinds of elements or things that exist but are not tied together in this beautiful cosmos that has this wonderful principles of design and interaction.
Hmm.
And then maybe there is a part of us that subconsciously, at least, wants to be able to say there is one thing of ultimate value.
Hmm.
Now, I don't know about that, but I'm just supposing. And to some people of a philosophical bent of mind, that can be an idea. So that'd be my best take at it. I think that's a very good question because you do see that.
Yeah, I mean, even now, theists say God, or it seems like there's always a desire. I wonder if there's the other subconscious thing is we want to be united. Yeah, we want to be united. So we want to be a part of something bigger than ourselves and even
Yeah.
ultimately.
Yeah, that might be the case.
Huh. Anyway, it's just something I noticed. I mean, it's like, okay, you've got earth, wind, water, and fire. Like, that's pretty good. Why can't you just have four? Why did these guys have to split hairs? Because it doesn't seem like they have to be in competition.
No, but there does seem to be that ongoing desire. I mean, Eastern thought is monistic, believe it in one thing, usually one element of reality, as it were. And then ancient Greek, the earliest Greek thought that we talked about, I guess you would call that monistic. You would view that shapeless stream as the one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else arises out of that and goes back into that. So it has a very long and widespread pedigree, this idea of monism that all is one.
So we broke it down into the four worldviews of theism, pantheism, polytheism and naturalism. It sounds like polytheism, when you dig down, it emerges from monistic thought, just like pantheism does.
I think that's a pretty good observation. And there's so many different kinds of polytheism. Maybe it's a broad statement.
Right, yeah.
But I think you're onto something there.
But naturalism is also going to do it. It's going to just say matter.
Ultimately.
And then
Matter,
theists are going to say God.
Matter, which sometimes takes the form of energy.
Yeah.
The two are interchangeable. I don't think that theism would be classified as monistic.
Right.
I also don't think, though, that it's dualistic in the classical sense of that term. It seems almost to me to go beyond that. It does believe that there is one ultimate reality, that is God. But at the same time, there is also a very real universe that he makes. And the one is subservient to the other. So God could exist without the physical cosmos, but not vice versa. But at the same time, the physical cosmos is still real. It's not simply an idea. It's a real thing. It has a different status in reality, as it were. So it's not dualism. It's not monism. It kind of transcends that distinction almost.
Yeah, it just makes sense to me that these guys who were just absolutely brilliant would come to a monistic understanding of reality without any divine revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Like that just makes sense to me. Like, yeah, there does have to be one thing. I don't know if I'm articulating that well, but it seems certainly reasonable if you're trying to think deeply about what is without any sort of divine revelation.
Yeah. There seems to be within the human mind, at least for many people who think deeply about these issues, a desire to bring it all under some idea of oneness.
Yeah.
That is a perpetual thing. And so if that's true, it's probably, from our viewpoint, God-given, even if the way that works out maybe is not fully true.
Yeah. Thanks for entertaining that.
Yeah.
That question.
Well, for what it's worth. That's a pretty good digression there.
Well, that's good. Yeah. Thanks for this next episode about Anaximander and Anaximenes. It's good. And I appreciate your analysis of their perspective.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I appreciate that. And that's what I'm going to try to do. I mean, we could talk more about each of their individual ideas, but I'm trying to give an understanding of the main idea of their thought, especially as it might impact current ideas or things that would come along later, and then analyze that and see how it all fits in so that we can understand the present a little bit better.
Yeah, and it certainly is helpful having the background of our discussions on the four worldviews, because I'm sitting here making all kinds of connections between what they're thinking and discussions that we've had in the past about monism or theism or that kind of thing. Already understanding the ideas of metaphysics and epistemology and ethics and all that stuff is just really helpful. It helps us look at what they're talking about and try to see again if it's internally coherent, if it's consistent, and if it's livable.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that.
Cool. Well, thanks.
My pleasure. See you next time.
See ya. Thanks so much for listening. If you like what you hear, click follow or subscribe depending on your platform. Check the notification bell so you're up to date with new episodes and leave us a review. Until next time.